Welcome to the Identity Store. This is a perfect rainy day activity, and if you can hear any additional noise, it's because there's quite a bit of rain at the moment on the window. So this is just a real fun half-term tutorial to make a little mini queen hat in sort of honour of Her Majesty, who does like her hats. If you want any inspiration, if you just type in queen hats on Google, you can find some really cool different ones. These are just ones I've kind of had a little play around with. She did wear quite a lot of blue, and I've made some moulded leather roses, which I'll show you how to do as well. So for this project I'm going to use the white calf leather, the pieces of white calf. You can equally use the natural. So this is a veg tan lightweight calf which we sell in pieces. It's nice and thin, but it's going to have some structure when it's bent round and coloured. The white is a veg tan as well, so if you wanted to be a bit fancy with any of these two leathers, you could do some stamping into them as well if you wanted to create some pattern on a hat band, for example. And these hats could be adapted, so you could make like a steampunk or a top hat or something. I'll leave it up to you. So to start with, if you download your template pattern from the email or from the website, if you want to get hold of that, just send a mail or a message if you haven't got the email to mail@theidentitystore.co.uk, and I will send you a template. They're all free of charge. So I've just cut mine out and I've masking taped them onto the leather, and before I cut anything out, I'm going to punch my holes in. So there are two things you can do for punching holes. You could use a round scratch awl like this, which if you're going to do that, you want to push the awl in through the leather. You can use it to mark first and then go round and do this after, but you want to push the hole right the way through to the rounded part of the shaft, so you get a nice large sort of stitch hole. And particularly if you're doing this project with your children or grandchildren, having the bigger stitch holes will just make it a bit easier. I'm going to use these little punches. These are reasonably new in. They come in 0.5 of a mil and 1 mil plus a needle point, which is a really tiny one, and they're really perfect for doing this sort of thing. They're nice and sharp, and to keep them sharp you want to make sure that you are hammering them through onto something that's going to protect this blade. So I normally have my stone block underneath, then a piece of Poundo rubber mat. An old magazine will work, but something that's going to really take the imprint of the stamp through without damaging it. So I've got these taped on. I'm just going to tap these out now. Then once that's done, I can cut these out. Now you can cut them out using your normal knife, but again, if you're doing this with children, this leather is thin enough to be cut with leather scissors. So these are our standard leather scissors, very inexpensive but very useful for cutting out. So if you cut out carefully, following the lines, and as you cut through where the masking tape isn't there and it just moves, just be wary of that. So I'm going to place this down on top now, back on position but on the reverse this time, and I'm just going to, with my biro, trace over that inner circle line, pressing quite hard to transfer the design. If it slightly tears the paper, that's fine, because then your ink will go through. And getting this bit neatly is just going to help. So just take a bit of a moment to get that pattern just through in there. And you should be able to see the pressure line, and I'm just going to go over it so that it will show up for the camera, but also so that I can see it when I come to cut out my inner circle. So I now have my inner circle drawn. Now cutting these are quite tricky, cutting circles. If you're careful, you can do it with your scalpel knife, with one of these. What I like to do is, again, especially if you're doing this as a kids project, if you make a starting mark with the scalpel just going into the center of that circle, and then another one you're basically going to look to cut out the first triangle using the scalpel blade. And you can lift that up, just get that loosened off. So if you've got yourself a little triangle coming up here, you can now have room to get your scissors in. Now for this, I like to go to these little old scissors I've got, which are quite small bladed. You can use the other ones, but you might need a bigger triangle, or an old pair of nail scissors are really good for this. Then just carefully cut around that line, making sure you don't cut any further up into where the holes are. Like so. And lastly, for this section of the brim, we want to cut some little snips. Now you want to be very careful to do this in between where the holes are. So just again, using the scissors, every 2 holes, go in between them and just make a little nick. It doesn't need to be much. This is just going to allow the hat brim to bend and fold upwards when we come to stitch it into place. Like so. So we've got little small little nicks. Those 2 are ready, and now we go to our rectangle. So if you get that cut out, and if you go to your mat, place it down, and if you draw a line with your scratch awl, a faint line, so measure down 1/2 mil, and I'm going to put a little tiny dot at the center where that is, not the center, sorry, where 5 mil is from the edge, and then I can do a little line to join those up. So you're doing a couple of strokes just to give you a guideline for your stitching to go into. And when that's done, if you get the template back, which has got the measurements for the holes here, if you lay it down and lay your piece of leather right up to where the holes are, making sure it's right in position, you can then use that to transfer where the dots go. So pressing again with the awl to mark where those holes are going to go. Again, you can punch them out using this scratch awl right the way through, the drive punch, or for any that are on the edges, I do really like to use the stitch punch. And this is the spring stitch punch. So very, very useful tool, very easy to use, easy on the hands, and get nice clean punch holes. So just lining that punch over those marks that you've made. And because it has a spring action and springs back, it's very quickly ready to move on to the next hole. So anything that you've got straight edges or you've got access to the side of the seam, this stitch punch is really useful and really inexpensive tool. So I've now got my stitch holes ready in this one, and I've now got my brim ready and this. So the last thing I'm going to do before I go to putting any dye on is I'm going to just take some of the leather off the edge so that I can get them to glue down later. So in order to do that, I'm going to use the safety beveler, and if you have like a French edge skiver, then that can work here. So on the reverse side, I'm just going to take, if I draw it in pen so you can see it on the camera, and also it will give me a guideline. So I'm going to take off the front edge of the grain that side, and then reverse it and on the other side here, so that when they come round they're slightly thinner, and when they glue you haven't got so much bulk here. So you just take your skiver, they have a curved blade in, and you just ease in and take some scrapings away. So for this one I'm going to use one of our Identity Store water-based leather stains, and I'm going to use the new pink colour, which is really vivid. These work brilliantly well on these white leather. You'll get really lovely bright colours, but the pink is especially cool. The purple's good, but just whatever you fancy. So I'm pouring some into a dish to start with, having given the bottle a good shake to mix up the pigments. So I have some in my dish. I have a piece of greaseproof paper or just some newspaper or anything underneath, but if it's newspaper, make sure it doesn't bleed through, so greaseproof paper is good. I've got some of this acetate film that was just left from some packaging. So I'm going to get my hat pieces, get my wool dauber. You may well want to wear gloves as well. It is a bit of a messy thing, and you're just going to work in circular motions and get the leather on. If you keep a bit of a cloth, piece of kitchen towel or anything handy, and just take off the top as you get it so you don't get any dried streaks. And I'm going to make sure I get all my edges covered in so that when they're stitched in there's nothing white showing. Lovely.
Tea?
I'm videoing. Yes please.
Oh, right.
Yes please. And for the brim of the hat, I'm going to add some of the dye onto the underside. So when you're dyeing the underside, it's a little bit trickier because it absorbs in quite a lot. So you kind of, rather than going in the full circular, you kind of just want to place it and push it into the flesh side, which will smooth it down. Like so. I'm going to put that way out of the way now. I might go back to it later in case there's any touching up that needs to be done. So I've got this on the underside, and making sure that this top brim is on a clean piece of my bit. I'm going to lay it down, and with my bone folder I'm just going to rub that, and this will compress the leather down. It presses all those hairy fibres and bonds them with using the wetness of the dye that you've put on, and it gives you a nice smooth back. And just press it, you get a kind of compression, so it gives a bit of a firmer set to the brim. And then make sure you wipe your bone folder off and wash it clean. A little bit of alcohol gel and a wipe will be fine, but just get that clean before you use it the next time. And I'm going to leave those just to dry now before I do my next part. And for the brim of the hat, I'm going to add some of the dye onto the underside. So when you're dyeing the underside, it's a little bit trickier because it absorbs in quite a lot. So you kind of, rather than going in the full circular, you kind of just want to place it and push it into the flesh side, which will smooth it down. Like so. I'm going to put that way out of the way now. I might go back to it later in case there's any touching up that needs to be done. So I've got this on the underside, and making sure that this top brim is on a clean piece of my bit. I'm going to lay it down, and with my bone folder I'm just going to rub that, and this will compress the leather down. It presses all those hairy fibres and bonds them with using the wetness of the dye that you've put on, and it gives you a nice smooth back. And just press it, you get a kind of compression, so it gives a bit of a firmer set to the brim. And then make sure you wipe your bone folder off and wash it clean. A little bit of alcohol gel and a wipe will be fine, but just get that clean before you use it the next time. And I'm going to leave those just to dry now before I do my next part. So while we're waiting for the rest to dry off, I'm just going to show you how to make some of the little embellishments for the hat. And this technique you can use and scale up for anything else. So we're just going to make some little flowers. So you'll see on the template there's some little patterns like that, and a spiral like this one. So if you transfer that design onto the leather, you can cut around the outside and then use the pen or the awl to scratch the design in and get those cut out. So when you've got it cut out and the design, I've drawn it on the top so that it's clearer for the camera, but you're just going to take the scissors to cut in to where that part was, and then you're going to follow those lines, so that basically you're almost cutting the whole thing into a spiral. Again, the smaller scissors can be a bit easier for doing this. And again, scissors are a lot easier than a knife at this stage for something this fiddly. And what we're really going to do with this is basically wet forming, which is where we allow a lot of moisture into the leather, and it allows us to create shape. So I'm just going to take this off. Now, if you wanted to make these look really beautiful and perfect and delicate, what you could do is to carefully take your skiver and just thin off on the petal edges. But for today, I'm just going to do it as it is, with the leather as it is. So I've now got that cut, and you can see it's kind of going out into a spiral shape. So with both of those two, I'm just going to get some water from my mist spray, and I'm going to give them quite a good dousing front and back. And I haven't dyed these yet. You can dye them at this stage, and that will give you some moisture in it, but just because of the video today, I'm just going to show you how to do it with it just wet, because it can be a little bit messier with your fingers otherwise, and sometimes the dye hasn't gone in all the bits that you can see when you finish and you need to touch up. So sometimes I just like to get them formed first and then dip them in the dyes. So you're going to take the center part, this is just softening up nicely now, and you're going to pinch that little center in with your fingers and then roll it. So you're going to start to create a little roll. That's going to be your center of your flower. Very fiddly to show you, but there we go. And then take the petals and just keep pinching that center and bring them all the way around quite tightly, like so. So you just keep rolling, really bringing those shapes around and folding them so that you end up with kind of a tight little spiral of them, like so. And keep holding it, pinching it together here, and then just with your fingers, starting from the outside, just start to roll back the outer petals. So you're rolling so that you're now getting the grain side showing. And you can actually sort of really start to manipulate them and pinch them, curl them down and out, flattening them all and working your way through. And just keep looking at it until it looks kind of more flower-like. You'll find as the water content really seeps through, the leather will become more malleable and you'll be able to do more with it. Don't get it too wet at the beginning because you want some structure still to remain. And whoop, bit fiddly. And there you start having more like a little miniature flower. So I would just now leave that somewhere to dry. You can pop it into the oven at 50 degrees if you want to speed it up a little bit, just for 10 minutes, just to get some of the water content, and that will make it go harder. And when you come to dye it again, if you haven't done it beforehand, you can slightly gently unpeel it. And when you do dye it, you'll notice it will get wet again. So you might want to just give yourself an opportunity to just correct out those leaves. And then you can add some glue. So normally I put a little bit of glue right through that center and then just leave it to, once it's dry, to just set in. So I have some that I made earlier. That was on a slightly bigger version, so it gives a bit of a bigger thing. So you can see for scale, it's quite a big piece on the hat, but that could be quite nice. And here's a little leaf that I've cut out, and then I've squeezed together with the wet forming, put a few little veins on. And so I think one of these hats, yeah, this hat has a little leaf painted and stuck on. They've just been stuck on with glue. And there's another one. So the other pattern works in a similar way. So you've got a slit that you're going to put in here, and just with your fingers you're going to start to really roll that petal. In fact, you can give it quite a firm twist, and that will start all of that whole petal kind of flower coming round in a spiral again, and then pinch it right in at the base here. And again, you're going to start by finding those outer petals and just rolling them, working your way round and into the center. And with these are a lot longer, these petals, so you can kind of tuck the center ones underneath so that none of the back of the leather is showing. This is where the light's gone a bit bright to show you, but I think you can get the idea. And again, once you've got it pinched in, you can, sometimes I use a peg just at the base to hold that base in position while it's drying off. They tend to always come out slightly differently. Okay, and now we're ready to do our hat stitching. So first of all, we need to just glue these two pieces together, either with double-sided sticky tape or with some glue. I'm going to use some sticky tape for speed here on the camera. The piece I prepared earlier, let's just pop you down there. So I'm just going to move off out of the way now, my die sheet. Let's press this down. So I'm using the double-sided sticky tape here, but you can use glue. And I'm just going to lift back my tape. And you want to fold over and line up to those lines that you had in, and give it a good press. I'm just going to run it down, press it down from the back, make sure everything's in place. Lovely. So there we have our crown of our hat. And first of all, we're going to sew the base down. So we want to just fold this back. It's pretty much dry, but just there's still a little bit of moisture. If yours is completely dry, you might want to just spray a little bit of moisture just on the inside of this inner circle, and you're just going to fold and press that back where we made those little slits earlier. It's just going to help that to sit into place like so. And then we need to get our thread. So I think for this one I'm going to use some red. Quite like red and pink together. You want 2 fingertip to elbow lengths. And you just need 1 needle for this. We're going to do a form of saddle stitch to stitch it, but it's going to we're going to do it kind of twice around. This will help us to make sure everything's kind of lined. Oh, pinch those up the wrong way. Sorry, they should have been pinched from the top. Rather than, so from the grain side facing down the top of your brim. That's it, just reverse those out. There we go. And I'm going to start with a knot through on the brim. I'm just going to bring my needle through the brim and then just find your first hole. And line it up, and then go sideways along to the next hole in the brim, and take it through and find your next hole along here. And pull that tight. And then on from the bottom of the brim, go one hole along and come up the next hole, so you're missing a stitch. And again, pull tight and down and along, and you get the idea. So you're missing a stitch each time, so effectively you're doing a running stitch, pulling both of those pieces of leather together. Keep working your way all the way around the hat. And when you get round to where you started, you're just going to continue but go through the opposite holes, so that this way you're filling in those gaps. Just got a little weak spot in my leather there, just there we go. Right, so then I'm going to go back on myself to get myself in the right position. So I'm coming back up through that knot that I started with in that same hole, and then I'm going to reverse. So I'm going to go do my stitching going backwards, filling in all those gaps, so it will now line up to and this should, all the holes should be pulled in neat together, so you should be able to go back quite quickly, finding those holes and pulling that stitch up. Now if your brim is still a bit damp while you're stitching this, it might end up pulling a bit out of shape. So this is a chance you have as well, where if you wanted to deliberately make your brim have a shape to it, you can use that moisture, that wetness, to form the brim into a shape that you want before it dries. Anytime you want to set a more hard aspect to keep the form going, you can use a hairdryer on it or bake it off in the oven for a little bit to get some heat into it, which will harden the leather. You're accelerating the drying process to create a harder shape. You can also achieve that same look with using warmer water. The hotter the water, the harder the shape. And then you're just going to do the same principle for the top of the hat. So exactly the same principle, lining up those holes, starting stitching round and then reversing back on yourself. And there you will have your hat. You can add a hat band, you can add your flowers, add beads, add some decoration, and as mentioned at the beginning, I'm just going to tie my last bit of thread off on this one. So I'm just pulling it through on the back, creating a loop that I can put a knot into, just to knot that thread off and out of the way. And with any of the wax thread, when you're doing your tying off, if you get your bone folder or the round part of your awl and press it down, you can squash those knots and those edges so that they disappear in. So there's the first part done. Now you'll see, where is it, one part of it, I got a little bit of a lift of some white fibres just here. So that's where sometimes you might just need to go round, maybe with a little cotton bud or paintbrush, and just dab in. So keeping a little pot of the dye before clearing up is you know, just handy. So from here we're going to pop the brim on, sew that on. This one here I did put a little hat band on, and again you could stamp or tool or make little mini stitch marks just decoratively on the hat, and then I've just used glue to secure it all in place. If you want, you can put a keyring hole in it and make a little keyring, or I have seen them done as kind of fun little fascinators on the side. So whatever you feel like doing with your little queen hat. I'd love to see what you've come up with and what you've made and how you've made this pattern your own. Thank you so much for watching. And when you get round to where you started, you're just going to continue but go through the opposite holes, so that this way you're filling in those gaps. Just got a little weak spot in my leather there, just there we go. Right, so then I'm going to go back on myself to get myself in the right position. So I'm coming back up through that knot that I started with in that same hole, and then I'm going to reverse. So I'm going to go do my stitching going backwards, filling in all those gaps, so it will now line up to and this should, all the holes should be pulled in neat together, so you should be able to go back quite quickly, finding those holes. And then you're just going to do the same principle for the top of the hat. So exactly the same principle, lining up those holes, starting stitching round and then reversing back on yourself. And there you will have your hat. You can add a hat band, you can add your flowers, add beads, add some decoration, and as mentioned at the beginning, I'm just going to tie my last bit of thread off on this one. So I'm just pulling it through on the back, creating a loop that I can put a knot into, just to knot that thread off and out of the way. And with any of the wax thread, when you're doing your tying off, if you get your bone folder or the round part of your awl and press it down, you can squash those knots and those edges so that they disappear in. So there's the first part done. Now you'll see, where is it, one part of it, I got a little bit of a lift of some white fibres just here. So that's where sometimes you might just need to go round, maybe with a little cotton bud or paintbrush, and just dab in. So keeping a little pot of the dye before clearing up is you know, just handy. So from here we're going to pop the brim on, sew that on. This one here I did put a little hat band on, and again you could stamp or tool or make little mini stitch marks just decoratively on the hat, and then I've just used glue to secure it all in place. If you want, you can put a keyring hole in it and make a little keyring, or I have seen them done as kind of fun little fascinators on the side. So whatever you feel like doing with your little queen hat. I'd love to see what you've come up with and what you've made and how you've made this pattern your own.